Hello and welcome. We're happy to have you join us this week. My name is Anna Woods, and I am going to quickly familiarize our viewers with the many benefits of today's webinar. And I have Jordan Mathlon joining me, and he will help the webinar run smoothly from behind the scenes. First, all webinar attendees are in listen-only mode to limit background noise. This is a 75-minute webinar with time built in for questions. And this is a great opportunity for you to pick the brain of the presenter and dive deeper into the content. Make sure to take advantage by submitting your questions in the control panel to the right of your screen. Your questions will remain anonymous, so no need to be shy, and we will answer them in the 15 minutes allotted for Q&A after the presentation. And this webinar also has opportunities for you to interact remotely by answering poll questions. The poll questions will pop up in a blue box, and you'll be able to click on the answer or answers to the question. SNA has approved this webinar for professional standards in Key Area 1000, Key Topic 1100 and 1200, Menu Planning and Nutrition Education, and Subtopic Local Foods, Farm to School, and School Gardens. And a webinar benefit is your ability to receive 1 CEU or CPEU credit. After the webinar, you'll be given a link to take an evaluation and quiz. And after the completion, you'll be able to save or print the CEU or CPEU certificate. And the link to the webinar evaluation will be provided at the end of today's webinar, and it will also be emailed to attendees 1 hour after. And we have a lot of useful resources today. The resources handout has a link to the Farm to School Network's website where you can find even more handouts. And there are 4 other handouts available in the section to the right of your screen in the control panel. And there's 2 infographics explaining the importance of benefits of Farm to School, and the other is a Getting Started with Farm to School guide. And as always, there is a PDF of today's presentation. And today's learning objectives are: explain what Farm to School is and how it can improve meal participation rates and consumption of fruits and vegetables, make use of available resources to bring Farm to School to cafeteria, classrooms, and the community, and examine how Farm to School trainings can be utilized as professional standards training. And we have 2 speakers today. We have Helen Dombalis, the Executive Director of the Farm to School, of the National Farm to School Network, and we also have Alena Paisono, Program Manager. And they have no affiliations or disclosures today. And I will hand it off to Helen. Thanks, Helen.
Thanks, Anna and Jordan, and thanks to the School Nutrition Association, a great partner of the National Farm to School Networks. We are delighted to have this opportunity to speak with you all today. So we are going to jump right in. Today's webinar, as Anna already referenced, is called Farm to School, Cafeteria, Classroom, and Community. And this first poll that's coming up is a question before we get started. We just want to get a sense of the attendees' expertise and experience with Farm to School to date. So if you all could answer this poll, we're curious to know if you already have experience with local purchasing, school gardening, nutrition education, food education, or none of the above. So let us know if you've already got any Farm to School experience. All right, well, it looks like about 2/3 of you all have some sort of Farm to School activity experience. About 1/3 of you don't, so that's great that we have some newcomers to Farm to School on the line. It looks like most popular amongst those of you who do have Farm to School experience is nutrition education. So that's really helpful context and just information for us as we dig into today's webinar content. So as we go to the next slide, I'm going to start by talking about the where of Farm to School, and that's relevant to the title of today's webinar. So Anna, if you could take us to our next slide, we are going to start by talking now about cafeteria, classroom, and community. So Today you're going to learn how to integrate Farm to School into the 3 C's, so cafeteria, classroom, and community, which again is the title of the webinar. And this is really the where of Farm to School. And the point in saying this and starting here is really for you all in your various roles to understand that yes, Farm to School activities can happen in the cafeteria, but they also happen in classrooms and they certainly happen in communities. And you can see that based on those 3 photos on the screen. So it happens out in the garden. Gardens can be a classroom as well. It happens in cafeterias, and then certainly it happens in communities, for example, with farmers and producers growing our food. So we just wanted to start with a moment to remind ourselves with those 3 photos why we're all here. On the next slide, now that I've talked about the where of Farm to School, I want to talk about the who of Farm to School. So this is the National Farm to School Network's map to explain to you all who we are. So as our name implies, the National Farm to School Network is indeed a national network. Our members are people who engage with the National Farm to School Network and receive our newsletter. We currently have more than 20,000 members. If you're not already a member, you can go to farmtoschool.org and join. It's free to do so. And we have members in all 50 states, Washington, D.C., and 3 of the 5 U.S. territories. I encourage you all to share the National Farm to School Network's membership with your state networks and partners, and of course, again, join yourself to continue to grow the National Farm to School Network membership base. And in particular, before we move to the next slide, I just want to flag for you all that the core partners and the supporting partners that are part of the National Farm to School Network are what we call our state affiliates. So those are folks, about 200 organizations total, that are part of the National Farm to School Network. So the point being that you all, in the work that you do, have farm to school partners and connection points in your various states. So the core partner and supporting partner organizations are not part of the National Farm to School Network as other organizations. They're their own organizations. So some state SNA chapters are actually part of the National Farm to School Network via those core partner and supporting partner slots. And then we have a national staff, myself and Alena, who you'll hear from shortly, and then an advisory board of exceptional leaders, and that includes several food service directors that are SNA members from around the country. On this next slide, I want to show you all more information on Farm to School, specifically giving you a chance to look at ways that you can connect with the Farm to School leaders in your state. So again, I mentioned those state core and supporting partner organizations that are part of NFSN. You can go to farmtoschool.org and click on our network to figure out who those points of contact are in your state. In the middle of the slide, you're seeing an example from Maryland. I picked that since that's the SNA headquarters. So Karen Fedor, for example, is with the Maryland Department of Agriculture, and Karen is the core partner for Maryland Farm to School. And then she has others in Maryland that are working with her as supporting partner organizations. On the left side of the screen, you'll see a map of state farm to school networks. This is a relatively recent resource that we released, and this is documenting states that have an official network, coalition, task force, association dedicated to farm to school. Farm to School is all about collaboration. It's all about partnerships. It takes everyone from food service directors to parents to farmers and producers and advocacy organizations to make Farm to School thrive. So I wanted to make sure you all know that you can click on the resource that's shared through this webinar to learn more about the state farm to school networks in your specific states. Again, there are many state SNA chapters that are already engaged in these state farm to school networks. And if you're part of one of the states that doesn't have a network and you're excited about today's content, you can certainly connect to the core and supporting partners there to help establish a network. And then on the right-hand side of the screen, you're going to see a map. Again, this is a relatively recent resource that we released, state farm to school positions. And what this does is show how farm to school is really getting embedded and institutionalized within state agencies, so that's state departments of agriculture, education, and health, as well as university extension programs. And then the gray are the few states where at this time we have no known state agency or university extension positions. But again, the point is for you all to better understand that there is a wealth of support and resources in your various states, including through the administering agencies for child nutrition programs in your state, so most often those state departments of education. So that's a little bit more about the who of farm to school. And then on the next slide, as we go to that, you're going to see the what of farm to school. So It seems like about 2/3 of you are already well familiar with Farm to School, but I always like to show this slide because I think it's a very nice way of putting together what we mean by Farm to School. So people hear Farm to School and they think of it as that literal Farm to School. So getting local farm fresh products into school meal and child nutrition programs. But Farm to School is also about school gardens, so giving kids that opportunity to have a hands-on learning experience with where food is coming from and how it's grown. And that's, yes, fruits and vegetables, but it can also be chickens or it can be honeybees at a school. And then education includes nutrition education, food education, and agriculture education. So all the ways that those things can be an opportunity to integrate with curriculum, whether that's taking kids out to the farm, bringing a farmer to the classroom or to the cafeteria, doing cooking demonstrations, taste tests, all the ways that kids can learn about food, agriculture, and nutrition. And the point is that ultimately these three core elements really support one another. You all, for those of you that are working to support child nutrition programs through school districts, can work really, really hard to, for example, get local broccoli into your school lunch program. But if the kids have grown that broccoli in the school garden, or they've met the farmer who's growing the broccoli you're serving, or they've done some sort of cooking demonstration like they do in DC where they'll prepare broccoli 3 different ways and the kids get to vote on which way is their favorite way of having it prepared. So if you do those other things, the procurement's going to be more successful. Ultimately, the research really shows that kids are going to be more excited to taste, try, and like those foods that you all have worked hard to procure when they've had those other gardening and education experiences. But the point is ultimately that there is no one defined program, but collectively the Farm to School activities empower kids and their families to make these informed food choices while supporting local economies and really contributing to vibrant communities. So it's not that you all have to do certain things in a very specific way in order to, check the Farm to School box, but we want to show you how these three core elements really support one another in achieving success in Farm to School. So now that I've talked about that, on this next slide, we've covered the who, we've covered the what. I want to show you the growth of the Farm to School movement. We've seen incredible growth in the movement over the last couple of decades. National Farm to School Network was founded in 2007, but Farm to School activities really started about a decade before that in the late 1990s. And the reason we've seen this tremendous growth is our next slide, and that's the why of Farm to School. Farm to School has grown tremendously over the last couple of decades because it works. So as we go to this next slide, I want to talk about the why of Farm to School. I know you all as attendees are very busy people with a lot already on your plate. So the question really is, why incorporate Farm to School into your work? And the answer is that it does, because it does your work for you. Farm to School really is a vehicle to make the child nutrition programs you run work better, and it helps you accomplish your goals. So examples of this are the fact that, and we call this the triple win, kids, farmers, and communities all win through Farm to School. So, for example, the research shows that kids who participate in Farm to School actually eat more servings of fruits and vegetables. And of course, you all, especially with the nutrition standards coming out of the Healthy Hunger-Free Kids Act, know that that's something that you're focusing on. So the idea is that when kids have grown it, when they've met the farmer, they've done that taste test or that cooking demonstration, they're going to be more excited about those foods. So kids win because they eat more servings of fruits and vegetables. Another example that's particularly relevant to you all is the fact that we know meal participation rates actually increase when Farm to School activities are being implemented. Again, it's getting kids more excited about what's being served, and then you see those meal participation rates, including for paid kids, go up, which is great for the bottom line for the meal program in the school district. Farmers win because we know that when you engage in local and regional food systems, you're shortening those supply chains, and then farmers are able to keep a bigger share of the dollar. And then communities win for a number of reasons, including the fact that farmers reinvest those dollars in their local communities, and also that kids take what they learned home with them. So the research shows that not only does it engage kids in the school day, but it also engages parents and families because kids take those learnings home. And we've heard stories and seen research, for example, about kids actually asking parents to take them to the grocery store to buy the types of foods that they've tried and been served at school, or to go to a farmer's market to meet the farmer that produced one of the foods that they sampled during the school day. Another way to look at this as we go to the next slide and continue to talk about the why of Farm to School are two of NSFM's signature resources. These are tools for you all. So the first of those is my personal favorite fact sheet. This is one of the resources available in your control panel, and that's the benefits of Farm to School fact sheet. So I just referenced some of the research on Farm to School. There is a lot more, and a lot that's relevant to you all in your roles. So the benefits of Farm to School fact sheet is essentially a literature review of the research that has been done on Farm to School. And it looks at it based on the recipient. So what are the benefits to students, to school districts, to parents and communities, to farmers? So definitely check out that research, especially as you're trying to implement more Farm to School activities and really need help making the case for why it's worth the investment. And then the second resource that is referenced on this slide is something called Evaluation for Transformation. It's a cross-sectoral evaluation framework for Farm to School. And the idea here is really that Farm to School is not only a triple win for kids, farmers, and communities, but it's also a cross-sectoral or multi-sectoral benefit. So Farm to School touches on public health, such as that increase in fruit and veg consumption, economic development, education, as you all are well aware, kids who eat better and are healthier, perform better in the classroom, and then certainly it has impacts on the environment as well. So again, that's a second resource. That one really is for those people that are implementing Farm to School activities and want to evaluate how it's working. Going to the next slide then, I want to just talk to you all about NSFM's core values. And I do this as a moment of pause. I want you all to see that the National Farm to School Network's values align with yours. Farm to School values include having Farm to School in all schools to nourish every child. So this goes back to our inception more than a decade ago. So our founders from the very outset recognized that one of our values, one of our goals, one of the things that we're striving towards is nourishing every child in all schools across the country. And so I just wanted to call that out in bold for you all just to see that Farm to School really is an opportunity to support you all in your roles, to support you in running child nutrition programs in school districts and even in early care and education sites across the country. So with that, I am now going to, with the next slide, pass it to my colleague because we want to dig into some of the specifics. We talked about an overview of the who, what, why, and a little bit of the how, but now I want to talk really specifically by passing it to my colleague, Alena Paisono, about how we actually get this done. Alena.
Thanks, Helen. Hi, everyone. So yeah, I'm going to dig a little bit into the local purchasing component of Farm to School. And I'm aware that looks like about 31% of you have some experience in this space. That's wonderful. Hopefully this is nothing new to you. And if so, it's always great to refine our skills. So I just want to touch on geographic preference. We understand geographic preference as a great tool for supporting school food authorities in their goals to increase local purchasing in a way that is in direct alignment with USDA recommendations. And so a real quick overview, geographic preference is a rule that has established that school food authorities have the ability to define local. So what does that mean? What that means is that there is no one set definition for local when you're sourcing, meaning in some school districts that might look at local as a radius around the school food authority, maybe 50 miles outside, you're going to procure from local farms, a county line, a state line, or even a regional line. I've seen some really innovative approaches to this, aligning it with sort of farming regions and watersheds. So just to say that the power of defining local is in your hands and is in the hands of the school. USDA has no definition on that. And the second piece is that geographic preference applies to unprocessed agricultural products. So what that means is that essentially these are products that have maintained their inherent characteristics. So there are some exemptions that we might look at to help us figure out, like, if we're trying to procure something that is indeed unprocessed by the standard. For example, cooling, refrigerating, and freezing is totally accepted, so you can go ahead and take advantage of a bumper crop, purchase those products at a low price, prep them, freeze them, and use them later in your meal program. Simple preparations such as peeling, slicing, dicing, chopping, grinding, and shucking, also allowable. Forming meat products into patties or fillets that can be served, drying and dehydrating. And I want to also talk about the fact that you can add, there can be minimal preservatives added to prevent oxidation, but not preservatives that will change the characteristic of the product. So things like also butchering livestock down to appropriate size cuts and pasteurization of milk are considered unprocessed. There's a clear definition for this within the Farm Bill, and it's really, really helpful when you're looking at applying geographic preference for a particular product. And the big thing about geographic preference is that it is a preference. It is not a specification. So you cannot go into your bid and specify that only producers with a product grown within a certain, say, radius of your school may bid on that product. What you can do is establish a preference within your bid that says producers who can provide a product grown within that radius are going to get a preference, making their product more competitive and therefore increasing their odds in the bid award process, even if the price might be slightly higher than something produced outside of your definition of local. I think I really want to touch on where to find local foods. So it can look like a direct relationship with the farmer. That relational piece is critical to the success of Farm to School, and I think it's where a lot of folks set their long-term goal. However, we know that that's a bit of a hurdle, and that for some folks, if you're trying to diversify your entire plate, you might also be procuring local foods from your broadline distributor, or maybe your produce vendor if that's a different distributor. You might be procuring those things from a food hub if you're in a region that has a wholesale food hub that you can reach out to, meaning there might be a third party involved there who's actually aggregating product from farmers and then selling it to you. That's totally allowable. As well as more informal ways of approaching procurement, such as going to your local farmers market and speaking either directly with the farmers or the market coordinator. And I've seen a lot of success in that approach and getting started, because it's a great way to reach out to the farming community and start building that bridge. And then also kind of testing the waters within your school by utilizing informal procurement strategies that are a little bit less intensive in terms of regulation. One thing that's really important is that even with the use of geographic preference, you must still adhere to the basic principles and regulations of the school meal program. One of those being American by American. So even if you establish your local preference option to be, say, a mileage radius around your school, and that dips into maybe Mexico if you're in one of our border states, it would not be considered meeting the standard of Buy American provision to go ahead and procure from Mexico first. So that is the one piece that you want to keep in mind, that crossing international boundaries and borders is not really utilizing geographic preference properly. Can I have my next slide, please? So moving into the next slide, we're going to talk a little bit about farm to school myths. And so these are a lot of things that I've heard working out in the field with school food service. So I'm going to start with some big picture questions. So this is a literal quote. The food must be GAP certified for me to be allowed to purchase it. And for those of you who are not familiar with GAP, the acronym Good Agricultural Practices is a voluntary certification program that producers can undergo to meet standards based on market demand. USDA does not require that food going into federally supported meal programs be GAP certified. Instead, they leave that decision-making power to the local entity, just like defining local. So it might be true that in your particular school district or school food authority that they do have a GAP requirement within the vendor packet, but not all schools have this. So it's not an inherent barrier to procuring from a smaller scale farmer or a farmer who does not have GAP standards. Now that said, knowing the jobs that everybody is doing and that we are concerned about food safety and risk management, most school districts have some sort of standard for food safety. And those have looked, range from simple checklists that are aligned with GAP standards to other types of certification programs, things like organic, or there's a variety of different GAP programs. Actually, there are, I think, at least 4 or 5 different GAP programs. So that's a really important one to understand, that you have the authority at the local level to define what requirements are necessary for the food. The only other thing I want to touch on there is to say that GAP certification, yes, it is a food safety program, but for those of you that have dug into GAP certification, it is not necessarily only about food safety. So you can meet those same standards of delivering safe and healthy food to the school without GAP certification if that's allowable within your policy. The second myth that I hear very often is, I can only purchase local food from my one vendor. So I've heard from people that they are working with one primary vendor and that they feel like they're limited to source their local product through that one primary vendor. And that is not true. There's ways of working around your primary vendor and with your primary vendor to be able to increase local procurement. So step 1, talk to your vendor, find out what they do have that would meet your standard for local. And if they do not have what you're hoping, you can encourage that and maybe talk to some other school food authorities in your region to help encourage that by showing more demand. Or you can work outside of your vendor by keeping under a micro threshold and keeping informal procurement. One great thing about farm to school and local products is that really often some of the varieties that we're procuring locally are actually unable to be produced by main vendors. So for instance, maybe a Cherokee purple tomato that you can get at the farmer's market, but a vendor cannot provide you. So that's a way of working outside of a contract that might be considered sole source. And then the last thing that is really important to underscore is that geographic preference applies to the entire plate. So you can apply geographic preference to milk, meat, and I wanted to put grain products there. It does not have to be only fresh fruits and vegetables, as we touched on earlier. There's some great examples that we've heard from within our own network, and I'm sure some of you are in areas that are digging into this as well. So Boat to School is a program that is operating in many states, but for the purposes of today, I'm going to talk about Alaska as one of those key areas in which that Boat to School has found a lot of success focusing on salmon. Grass-fed beef, there's a number of schools in a number of states that have worked on procuring grass-fed beef, mostly for local events and celebrations, not necessarily every day on the meal pattern, because we do understand that cost can be a challenge around that one, but it's absolutely allowable. Fish and shellfish, there's some great examples of folks procuring shrimp and crawfish from that I've heard from Louisiana. In my home state, New Mexico, I know that a lot of our school food authorities are purchasing locally raised beans, dry beans and fresh beans, and for their meal programs utilizing our state fund. And then traditional foods in Native communities. So this is a big area where we go beyond fruits and vegetables and start talking about products that aren't conventionally available on the wholesale market, like blue corn or bison. And those things can be integrated into the local plate, utilizing the same nutrition standards through substitution. I am going to go ahead and hand it back over to Helen to continue to dig into the details of Farm to School. Thanks.
Thanks, Alena. All right, so that may have, especially for those of you that don't have experience with local purchasing, feel like a lot. It may, seem like new additional work when you all already have a lot going on, or no pun intended, a lot on your plate. So, the idea here really, and I wanted to come back to this slide, is that Farm to School isn't one size fits all. What works in one district may or may not work in another, but there are overarching reasons to explore all the ways to make Farm to School work for you. And it's really aligns with your professional standards. So as you can see here on the slide, and you all are well aware, SNA has professional standards and learning objectives. And so I just wanted to take a moment to pause for you all to see that those include farm-to-school activities. So there's that standard 1130 about utilizing local food sources, especially farm-to-school when possible. 1220 about nutrition education curriculum and how that can support the cafeteria as a learning environment. And then 1230 about school gardens as a means of nutrition education. And I think what's really neat about looking at these three together is the fact that you can see in there those three core elements that I talked about earlier. So local procurement, nutrition and food education, and then school gardening. So for you all, just taking a moment to point out that these are professional standards and learning objectives. And of course, at the end of the day, it's not just about you all, achieving certain learning objectives and checking a box, but really it's about making your programs that you all are running and working so hard and so incredibly well to run work better. And again, it goes back to that triple win of the fact that we know farm to school makes those nutrition programs work even better when it comes to consumption, when it comes to reduced plate waste, which I hadn't referenced earlier, but it is another research point that we found through farm to school about reduced plate waste. And certainly the fact that your meal participation rates can increase. So going to the last few slides before we open it up for Q&A, I just want to make sure you all are aware of some resources from the National Farm to School Network. So some of those we've already talked about, but we do have a resource library. If you go to farmtoschool.org and click on resources, you'll see that we have this resource database, and it's incredible because it's searchable. So you can go in and you can look specifically for procurement resources. You could go in and say that I'm looking for a recipe with strawberries because you know that you're going to be serving strawberries. You can look for specific lessons that align with strawberries. The idea really is that NFSN was created in 2007 because there was a demand for a national clearinghouse of resources and training and technical assistance, and then people. So that resource library is one example. On the right side of the screen, I took a screenshot of what happens when you go to our resource library and search for just procurement, local procurement resources. So these are resources, not just those created by the National Farm to School Network, but by our partners. So you can see that things that come up, including how to address reducing and recovering surplus food in schools, focus out of Wisconsin on use of traditional foods, so something that Alena referenced a couple of minutes ago, incorporating organic products, the resources that we recently released, and then how to have conversations. If you're in food service and you want to have a conversation, for example, with producers, it's a guide out of New Jersey on how to do so. So I just wanted to make sure you're aware of those resources. And then lastly, in the bottom right of the screen, the U.S. Department of Agriculture has, as of a few years ago, an Office of Community Food Systems. So this is housed within the Food Nutrition Service, or FNS, at USDA. But this is a national and regional team of folks that are also there to support you all in implementing farm to school. They have incredible knowledge, wealth, resources as well, especially on local procurement. So I just wanted to make sure you know that they exist and they're there to support you too. So Anna, if you could go now to our final slide, this is a poll for you all. So you've heard a lot of content about what farm to school includes and how it's an advantage and a value add to the work you all are doing. So the question is, which activities, now that you've heard this presentation, are you eager to get involved in? So we're going to go to the poll and see what you are inspired to do going forward. All right. Well, I have to admit those are some surprising results to see that the thing you all are most interested in digging into is school gardening. But that's great. That's fantastic. It is, as I referenced, one of those professional standards, and it certainly does help support the work that's happening through the child nutrition programs in the cafeteria. So second, it looks like local purchasing. So I'm going to pass it back to Anna, and we'll be excited in a few minutes to really open it up for a conversation with you all to hear what questions you have, because again, we want to support you all in continuing the work to increase farm to school in your communities.
Okay, thank you so much for all that information. Yeah, it is exciting to hear that people are interested in school gardens. So I was hoping we could start off by talking a little bit more about that. What you think, if somebody's interested in doing that, what are the first steps that you think they should take?
Sure. Well, this is Helen. I can start, and then Alena, please jump in. So when it comes to school gardening, I think there are a number of things that are important. Obviously, first and foremost among those is finding out what's already happening in your district. So there may be a school garden that's already in place. There may be multiple. So certainly starting by finding out if there's anything already in existence that you can work with or add on to. I think second is recognizing that gardening doesn't have to happen, outside, and you don't have to have a lot of land for that. And by that I mean it could really be starting with some container pots. So working with educators that you have close relationships with, asking them if they've got any container pots going in their classroom, and if they could start planting some things in those classroom container pots that relate to things that are going to be served in the dining setting, so that kids can start to get more excited about what's coming up on the menu. And next thing I would do when it comes to gardening is keeping in mind the sustainability of gardens. And by that I mean not what's actually being produced from like a sustainable agriculture standpoint, but from a standpoint of keeping the garden going. So one thing that we have unfortunately seen in the last couple of decades there is that people get excited about building school gardens, and then kids go out of school for the summer. And a lot of times that's when a lot of work is happening on the garden and when things are in full bloom and full harvest. And so it's important to keep in mind, who's going to maintain that work. And with that, we've seen everything from summer food service programs that school districts are running where the gardens get incorporated into that and it's activities for the students, or just having a group of student volunteers that come back, having a parent or a group of parents volunteer, or even having custodians that can help keep things running. So I think, again, it's important when you think about getting engaged in gardens, not just finding out what's already happening, but thinking a few steps forward about what that could look like. And then if it is ultimately the case that you're going to be breaking ground on a new garden, water is a very important thing to keep in mind. It's amazing how many times, folks will break ground, they'll plant seeds, they'll get things up and running, and then realize, gosh, we don't really have the energy to haul water from inside. We need to make sure we have a water hookup on the outside. So that's just another important tip that I'll mention. And let me pass it to Alena to see what else she has to say about school gardens.
Thanks, Helen. I have a lot to say about school gardens. I think school gardens are amazing. And I think, the first step is understanding why you want to establish your school garden and what the goal is for it. Because depending on the goal, the garden is going to look very different and function very differently. So for example, a garden that's really focused on production, a garden, say you want to establish a garden so that you can help get that food into the cafeteria, is going to look different and have different requirements than a garden that is focused on education, particularly education across grades and ages. Or a garden that is focused on building community and bringing parents and elders and community members in is going to have a different way of operating and a different infrastructure. So to kind of dig into that a little bit, I'll talk about some of the different garden models. And I would say that no matter what, the first thing to do when you want to build a school garden is build your team. So build out a garden team. Make sure that you have representation from teachers, from parents, from students. That's a best practice that we see when student clubs or student council is involved in the design of the garden. And then also being sure to include maintenance and janitorial. If your maintenance team is not on board, it can have major issues in terms of how the garden is cared for, access to water, as Helen mentioned. I've seen examples of gardens accidentally being mowed down because the maintenance team didn't know and they were following their job of landscaping. Things like applying pesticide and chemical that happens in adjacent areas to your garden. Those are the folks that you need to talk to understand those implications of design in your garden. So building the team is I think, the most foundational piece to making sure that you have garden sustainability in the long run. Ideally, those teams would also have community members. Helen mentioned the idea of summer meal sites as being a great way to bridge the gap of tending the garden in the summer. I've also seen some really great examples of schools working with like the Boys and Girls Club or local churches or local youth organizations, and just trying to understand how can this be a benefit to the entire community, not just the school community. Now, that said, there are some regulatory things that pop up when you start inviting the broader community onto school grounds. And there are some tools you can use for that, such as joint use agreements. So working with your school board to establish a policy that states that it's allowable for certain individuals to come into school grounds and that they understand that they're accepting liability for activities. So those are some core, like, foundational pieces to getting your garden going. I think also the best success in school gardens tends to be when it's integrated into the broader school community in as many ways as possible. So trying to link it to curriculum, for example, that might be kind of the obvious pieces like science and biology, or it might be an arts curriculum. There's a lot of schools that link in creating public art and garden signage into their art and even language revitalization programs in Native communities or bilingual education in other communities. So realizing that it doesn't have to just be the science teacher, you can look outside at other subjects and find out alignment with different teachers. There's been examples of cultural education in the garden by having like different plots focusing on different regions and talking about history. So there's lots of ways to approach it to make sure that it is a useful teaching tool, with the ideal standard of getting it aligned with standards-based education, but understanding that it might start with just making sure that there's adequate learning opportunities in a variety of ways in the garden. The next piece is, you know, if you are really focused on wanting to produce food, linking to the cafeteria and understanding what are some of the rules and practices in place in the cafeteria that you'll need to understand to have success in harvesting and post-harvest handling in your garden. So, for instance, understanding, can you use their sinks to wash the product as it's coming in? What are the rules around that? How do these products need to be stored? Are you going to need a separate storage space? Labeling, all those different pieces when you start introducing garden-grown foods into the cafeteria. There's a lot of great resources out there that are garden food safety checklists, and they tend to include some of those critical questions that you would want to talk to with your food service staff about if one of your goals is actually serving that food, whether that's through the main food meal program or if it's even through a taste test type of activity, because you still need access to the kitchen to be able to prepare those foods. So that's a really important one. And then, you know, taking as much effort as you can to integrate the products that you're serving in your meal program, even if they're not local. So if you have a lot of carrots and you're always having carrots on your meal program, it might be a great idea to make sure to plant some carrots in that garden so the students have the opportunity to experience the production of foods that they're familiar with, even if that particular food wasn't procured locally. I think I'll pause there and open it up if there's any questions, because I just threw a lot out at you. But yeah, school gardens are such a great tool. I think it's just about taking the time to make sure you've built community around it and you have a clear plan so that you can really make the most of the investment in that space as an outdoor classroom and as a community space as well.
Thank you, Alena. And is there any like specific example of a school or district that comes to mind with how they incorporated it in their classroom, or you know, what vegetable they chose to first grow when they were just starting out, something that would be easier to start out with?
Yeah, I'll jump in, and then Helen, if you have any thoughts. So I mentioned I'm based in New Mexico, so our gardens have a very particular characteristic of needing to be water friendly. So I've seen a lot of success actually with things that are approachable, and one of my favorite examples was a salsa garden. So this school just took 2 or 3 raised beds, and they grew everything that needed to go into making salsa, because salsa is something that a lot of our students are used to, and it's a food that they're very familiar with, even how to make possibly. So having, onions and cilantro and garlic and peppers and tomatoes growing in the garden, and then being able to make salsa and serve it as a tasting. And then I think they were even trying to do an after school club that they could learn about preservation and do a little bit of canning of that product. And if one wanted to take it further, you could then talk about selling that product back to parents or something like that. And so that's one of my favorite examples that's just really tangible, doesn't take a lot of space, but has a really big impact on students.
Yeah, and this is Helen. A few quick examples. I think one of my favorites in the early childhood space was in Tucson, Arizona. Again, recognizing that gardens can be container pots. So it was 3-year-olds learning how to count, and they had little container pots that they were going to keep in the classroom and then take home, and they were counting 1 broccoli seed, 2 broccoli seeds. So just an opportunity to connect that curriculum to really growing food at a very early age. Another favorite example comes out of Vermont, where they planted a series of gardens alongside the football field. So it was in a very prominent place where pretty much everyone in the school would see these gardens, and they were planted by history students, so high school history students, looking at production of food in the United States over time. So going back to pre-contact all the way through the various centuries leading up to today, to kind of look at how has production of food in this country changed over the centuries. So an opportunity for them to really grow food while also learning about American history. And then lastly, I'll mention, and I am unfortunately failing to remember at this moment exactly what school district this was, but it was a school that I visited where they had school gardens, and it was an elementary school where the various teachers over time would use those same gardens for different curriculum. So you may have a 3rd grade science teacher who would come out and use it to talk about plant biology. And then you would have a 5th grade math teacher that would come out, and they would, if they were learning about multiplication and division, they would take temperatures of the compost and then track averages of the temperatures of compost over a 2-week period of time. So what I thought was so neat about that example is it was the entire school community utilized the same school garden. So it was the same things that were being grown, but it was just being used in different ways for different educational purposes. And then, of course, that food was then being used in the dining setting as well.
Wow, that's a lot of...
Add one more quick piece, because I think we're remiss if we don't mention that school gardens also include non-edible things. And so a school I've been working with based out of Montana, the Hardin School District, they've been working to establish a native foods program, and a piece of that was producing an orchard. So they took the long view perspective and said, hey, we do have a lot of land. Maybe we could plant an orchard that would keep providing for years and years and years, and kind of building in that sustainability. The other piece of what they did was plant a medicinal and craft garden. So they have a high population of Native American students in their district. So they wanted to see medicinal plants, which tend to be perennials and are pretty easy to grow because they are indigenous to that space, as well as plants that were used for craft. So certain plants that could be made into basketry or dyes. And so there's a whole nother side of school gardens that you can go to beyond the meal program that still offer those opportunities for a variety of education.
Thank you for those examples. So sticking with school gardening, this question is, I am a BSN student working on nutritional needs of kids in my community as a final project. I'm curious if there are any kickback incentives or funding assistance available for schools to encourage them to develop a school garden.
Anna, read that one more time. So kickbacks are incentives, so financial incentives for schools to develop gardens.
Correct.
So, Alena, I'm happy to start, and then please jump in. One of the resources we didn't share, but we can get to Anna to make sure to share with you is two things, actually. One is getting started with school gardens resource that we have. I didn't realize how excited you all would be about gardening, so that's great. So we'll get that to her. Second is a funding for farm to school fact sheet, so that gives information on the various funding sources. So this doesn't exactly answer the question, but I think it's important to acknowledge that school gardens are, on the whole, depending on how fancy you get, if you develop greenhouses and beehives and compost bins, but on the whole, relatively inexpensive. But at the end of the day, school districts still, of course, are, strapped for cash. And so they're great funding sources that help get gardens up and going. So that's everything from like Home Depot and Whole Kids Foundation. And then there are grants through USDA. I think as far as the question specifically about whether or not there are incentives financially, I think one of the incentives is having product that can then be brought into the cafeteria or into the classroom for, taste tests, for example, that's essentially free to very low cost. So opportunities to get that product into those meal programs, but when it's being grown directly at a school garden or farm, you don't have the same cost that might be associated with sourcing it, from a producer or from a distributor. Alena, do you have anything to add to that?
I do. There are a couple different resources that schools can use. For one, within the meal program, the federal meal program, it states that you are allowed to utilize the funds or a portion of those funds to buy seeds, as long as you don't then buy the food that was produced by those seeds. So that's actually a really great starting point. If you can talk with your food service team and see if there's just a little bit of wiggle room in the budget to procure those seeds. That's one step. And then Helen mentioned, working at the local level with entities like Home Depot or other stores. And I've seen so much success in that space of working with in-kind donation and just going out to local businesses that are invested in the community and finding out what they're willing to support, as well as partnerships with municipalities. So here in Santa Fe, for instance, our municipality runs a composting program, and they were willing to help support the purchase of some soil from one of their partners for some gardens a while back. So just, looking outside of the school and thinking, how does this meet other goals within my community of either private or public entities? One other thing that I've seen being leveraged is funds for the special diabetes program being leveraged into the establishment of school gardens, particularly across Indian country, but realizing that that is sort of an unconventional source for school gardens that's coming out. And then similarly, there are funds available within the Office of Indian Education for those of you in regions that have Native American populations. The formula grant program that's provided through Title VI, I believe, might be 7. It can also be applied for things like school gardens because it is about culturally appropriate education, and school gardens can be a great tool for that. So those are a couple other places to get started. But I would, start digging around your school first and find out what resources are there. There's so often, people come with the vision of starting a garden and find out like, oh, there was a garden 5 years ago and we still have remnants of this or that. So starting there is a great best practice.
Okay, we're going to switch topics to micro purchasing. This question is, when speaking on micro purchases, which is an accumulative threshold value, how do you justify buying a potato as a micro purchase when you're already buying potatoes from a vendor?
Yes, I can answer that question. So that all comes down to having a specification for the potato that you wish to buy under micro purchase. So you're not going to buy the same grade A russet potato that you're buying from a vendor. You might be buying a purple potato. And so making sure that you have an established specification within your binder essentially and within your bid. And so people have done this after the fact and doing it as part of the documenting 3 bids and buy. And so you can say, just write it out. I want a potato that looks like, and name the characteristics of size, freshness, color, a variety if you know it. And a great place to start that conversation is to go to the farmer's market or to a local farmer or even a store and take a look at what's on the shelves and talk with them and find out what would an appropriate specification be, so that you can record that I used my micro purchase because I wanted to buy this potato that was not in alignment with the specification I have on my main bid. So you still need to go, whether it's going, I like the farmer's market, so I'm talking about it a lot because I think it's really easy. Like if it's season and you're looking, say, for a potato, you can go to 3 different farms, see their potatoes, see which ones meet your spec and write down the price. You can do it on a sheet of paper and then just put that into your binder when you get back to your school and you've done your due diligence around a micro purchase. I hope that answers your question. I can keep going if there's more.
That really helped me understand that more. We just had a webinar on procurement last week and I had some inquiries as well. I think that was a great explanation. Our next question is, how do you come up with recipes that will meet school nutrition requirements using the farm fresh foods?
Alena, do you want to start that? Yeah.
I can jump in, Helen, and then you can take over. There's a number of recipes that have been developed. So number one, trying to figure out what's out there. We have some of those, as Helen mentioned, on our website. You'll find different recipe books. There's also I'm going to totally forget the name of it, Learning Labs out of California. They have on their website, you can search for curriculum and I believe recipes. The Chef Ann Foundation also has recipes that have been aligned in terms of portioning as well as nutrition standard. And really what's important is that you're able to identify the nutrition standard for all the products going into the recipe. So you might have some of those already within your binders and specifications in the food buying guide. The food buying guide does include quite a bit, but if some of these products are not within your food buying guide, there's also another resource called the National Nutrient Database that is a federal resource that is searchable, and it has like every food, including wild foods, forage foods, things that are not conventional. And so if you can't find it in your food buying guide and you want to develop your own recipe, that's a great place to start. Schools that I've worked with locally have then partnered with various universities to try to do some, more long-term recipe development around a set of products. So that's also a way of going, is partnering with an educational entity that has a nutrition or dietetics program and finding out how you can work together.
And this is Helen. Could you read that question one more time? Because I think I have something to add to that.
Sure. Let me go back to it here. How do you come up with recipes that will meet school nutrition requirements using the farm fresh foods?
Yeah, okay, thank you. I think another way to think about that question is actually the reverse. So you can, figure out what you want to serve based on, the nutrition standards, based on recipes you've got. And then, and this may take more work, but go about figuring out, let's say, for example, you're wanting to serve, I'm from North Carolina, local sweet potatoes a meal with sweet potatoes. You can then talk to your, vendors, for example, about whether or not they know of local sweet potato producers that they could source from. Or when you ask that question, what you may find is the products are local and they're just not telling you that. And then the farm to school work has already happened. It's just now you know about it and you can promote it to the students and to the eaters for them to get more excited about. So I think that's another way to consider it. And then again, there is NFSM's resource library where you can search for recipes. I think something important with farm to school is to, start small. So you could just go to your farmer's market sometime, in August and find out a product that's going to be coming up in September or October, for example, and develop that relationship and say, all right, October is Farm to School month. I want to serve one local product for one day during October. And just starting small and building from there can really help to develop those relationships.
And real quickly, Anna, just one thing that I would add is similar to what Helen was saying, a great place to get started is just looking at what you're menuing already and figure out where you can sub in local product. So the great approach to that is that you know that students are going to consume it, your staff is already skilled in being able to prepare it, and so you can just start subbing in products that you maybe weren't purchasing locally in case you find out they weren't with the local product. And then it's just about making sure that you're ordering, that your spec for ordering has an appropriate ratio to be able to do your formula for the amounts. But that is such an effective way of starting, and then just marketing it on the menu, just saying this is local today, so that parents and students understand that it is different. Another thing I've seen is utilizing some of the flexibility around offer versus served throughout the week for fresh fruit and vegetable, and buying local product and not necessarily dictating what it is on the menu per variety, but saying a local fruit or vegetable serving, and then being able to use offer versus serve to have a variety of things throughout the week. And that way you can just start small, and if for some reason you're not able to source, or your farmer doesn't deliver you the amount you need, you're not sort of stuck in this place where your menu is then irrelevant. So that's another great way of doing it.
Okay, and one
really quickly, I'll jump in really quickly just to say I think I need to re-emphasize the point I made a minute ago. A great place to start is also just asking those currently supplying your programs where the products come from, because it may turn out that you're already getting things locally, and it just takes that marketing. And we've got some great food service directors around the country, but they'll get posters, for example, of farmers, and then farmers really become heroes, which they are. And so, it may be products that you're already sourcing, but it's just about promoting where they're coming from so the kids can get excited about them. Or Donna Martin, one of our favorite farm to school advocates, runs a program in rural Georgia, and she has done farmer trading cards. So decades ago, kids traded baseball cards. How cool is it to think about trading farmer and producer cards to really show that farmers are heroes and get kids excited about what you're serving?
That's great. I love that idea. And then one of our attendees, also, you might have already touched on this, Helen, but I'll repeat it. She said to use the new recipe analysis workbook that's part of the USDA food buying guide online, and that will credit any meal pattern ingredient, except for like sugar and spices. But that should also be a helpful tool. And
great.
Our next question, I love this. We're getting so many good questions today. I guess this is just generally back to school gardens for a minute. I'm not sure what position they hold in their school district, but where would you start with who to talk to about joining a school garden within the school?
Alena, you want to take that?
Sure. So assuming that there's already an active school garden, I think a good spot to start is figuring out what the PTA or the parent organization is in place and asking them. It tends to be that school gardens are heavily supported by parents, and so they might be able to point you in the right direction. And then also chatting with teachers. So if you do know that you have maybe a son or daughter that's in one of these programs and they are using it in a class, reaching out to them and just finding out how you can get involved to help support the garden. I will say that not always do all members of the school community have a lot of knowledge around the garden, so it's not necessarily an inherent first step to reach out to the principal or to administration, but in some schools that might be also a great first step. But the parent organizations tend to have a sense of what's happening in the garden.
Thank you. Okay, I'm trying to cipher through here. And then let's talk a little bit about who at the USDA can help you get involved in Farm to School?
Sure. So this is Helen. As I mentioned a few slides back, a number of years ago, through USDA's Food Nutrition Service, or FNS, a new office was created called Office of Community Food Systems. So they have 5 national staff based in their headquarters in Alexandria, Virginia, but then they also have regional leads. So as you all are well aware, there are 7 regions for FNS around the country, and there are regional leads for the Office of Community Food Systems in each of those 7 FNS regions. And then additionally, they've now added other staff within those 7 FNS regions that can focus, for example, on procurement, that can focus on farm to CACFP, which we really haven't even had a chance to dig into the child adult care food program and that, early childhood space. What I'll do, Anna, is I can send a link through the chat box to you, and you can share that out with folks for the Office of Community Food Systems. But USDA, again, has the people, but then they also have the information. So Alena and I both, for example, have been through a local procurement kind of train the trainer. So they offer trainings around local procurement. They host events in the various regions. So they're, a wealth of resources, including on geographic preference.
Okay, I just kind of successfully sent the link to everybody. I accidentally sent it twice. And then I saw Helen, that you sent another one, so I'll send that one out. It's on the garden link. What I'll also do to make it a little less messy here is we'll add them to the on-demand, so I have the ability to add a handout to the on-demand section where I'll have those links hyperlinked in the handout. But if you're not going to be able to get to the on-demand, I also just sent them out in the chat if you want to copy and paste them somewhere else for you to reference later. But the handout that is in the handout section has a general hyperlink to their website where you'll be able to find all kinds of resources there. And if you click around, can find stuff on these topics. Right, Helen?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay,
yep, and I just sent you, Anna, that Office of Community Food Systems link as well if you want to share that one out.
Okay. I think I'm getting lost in my links here, but I think I found it. So I'm going to send that one out too. Thank you. Okay, one more question here. My school district is K-12, but also has Head Start programs. Can you do Farm to School and early childhood education?
Awesome question, and that, I promise that wasn't teed up. But yes, so starting in 2011, NFSN recognized that early childhood is a great opportunity for Farm to School for a number of reasons, and you all know these things, I'm sure, being in the professions you're in, but I'm sure many of you are also parents. Those earliest years of life are formative years of life for developing healthy habits. It's literally when taste buds are forming. It's also one of the periods of life when parents are most engaged in their kids' lives. So it's a great opportunity through Farm to Early Care and Education to not only engage the kids, but also to engage the parents and the families. So we've been doing this work in Farm to ECE, or Farm to Early Care and Education, since 2011. And so that includes CACFP, which I mentioned earlier. It includes Head Start and Early Head Start. And I'll send you links. We do have a Farm to School Head Start resource available. It really includes all of the different ways that kids learn in those 0 to 5 age group, preschools, family home daycares, but I think most relevant to you all are CACFP programs and, Head Starts that are attached to K-12 districts. So yes, the answer is absolutely yes. And it's really not only cute to see those little kids getting excited about where their food comes from and having those hands-on opportunities, but it's also just really important to get them engaged from a young age in learning about this stuff. So Anna, I'll send you that Head Start resource.
Wonderful, thank you. Okay, so that is all the time we have for Q&A. I hope we were able to get to everybody's questions. Again, we did send out those links through the chat box, but they'll also be on the on-demand page. And I just want to say thank you so much, especially for the extended Q&A. We really hit you guys with a lot of questions. Really appreciate your openness to answer them all. And thank you for, putting this deck together. I know this is a newer subject for me, so it's great to hear all the different procurement options and different things you can do. And glad to hear that our attendees are so interested in school gardens as well. So thank you. And I think, Helen, I'm going to pass it back to you so you can explain some of your upcoming activities.
Great. Thanks, Anna. And I just sent you those other resources on Farm to ECE and Head Start. So just in wrapping up, we want to make sure you all know about some upcoming events through the National Farm to School Network. I referenced this earlier, but every year in October, we celebrate National Farm to School Month. So this is something we work to get congressionally designated through a congressional resolution back in 2010, so same year as the Healthy Hunger Free Kids Act. And now we lead in collaboration with partner organizations around the country, including SNA, an annual celebration. So you can find out more on our website, farmtoschool.org, but just want to make sure you all know if you're interested in digging into Farm to School more, that October is a great time to start because there's already going to be a lot happening in your state. It's a great time for sourcing, of course, and it's just a good time to really open a conversation about Farm to School. And then second on the slide, every other year we host something called the National Farm to Cafeteria Conference. So Farm to Cafeteria meaning not just K-12, but also early care and education sites, farm to hospital, farm to college, farm to prison. So all the ways, especially from a procurement standpoint, that we can better learn from other institutions about how to make Farm to School work in K-12 and ECE settings. So we're going to be going to Alena State, New Mexico, April 20th through 24th, 2020 in Albuquerque. Registration will open in the new year. The request for applications to host workshops will open later this summer, to save the date. And then if you do want to make sure you get announcements when those things open, the RFA and then the registration, be sure to sign up for free to be an NFSN member through farmtoschool.org.
Thank you. And on our end here at SNA, we want to let you know about our last webinar of the season. We just added this on before and probably, after some of you guys are out of school. But we are going to do a breakfast in the classroom, and it's based on the Breakfast Summit that the School Nutrition Foundation and Partners for Breakfast in the Classroom recently had. And we're going to have our own Sarah Murphy-Youssef and some other speakers from those organizations come together, and they're going to focus on how the districts utilize data to inform decisions and tell the breakfast story. We'll have we're going to open registration this Friday, so there will be a whole description, and you can hear about the other presenters, including Meredith Potter and Stephen Horniak, of different, they're both of the Houston County schools in Georgia, and Lauren Koff there. So that'll be great. And, we will be ending the webinar season, which is always sad for us over here, but hopefully you can join us for that last one before summer break. And let's see. We're just gonna now go into the evaluation and quiz. This is the link for today's webinar. If you type this link into your browser, you'll be led to the evaluation and quiz, and then you'll be able to get your CEU or CPEU certificate for today's webinar. We'll jump off the line, but we'll leave this screen up so that you can copy and jot it down. But for those that stayed till the end, you'll get an email in 1 hour that also has the link for those that stayed till the end. And thank you again for all of your questions, and really appreciate you guys taking the time out of your day, and we hope you can join us in June. Thanks. Have a good one.
Thank you.
Thank you.